You're listening to I Love It When, and I'm your host, Mo. I'm a speaker, coach, and connector. You're in the right place if you're looking for some inspiration and you're ready to truly embrace who you are. My intention with this podcast is to help you see that you are so much more powerful than you realize. Hey everybody, welcome back for another episode of I Love It When. I'm your host, Margaret, and I'm really excited today to have Cheri Constantino-Shore with me here on the podcast. And as you know, I like to bring on different people and perspectives and stories that I think you would find useful, entertaining, informative, educational. And I was introduced to Cheri through a friend of mine, Jered Burton, who you guys have gotten to know a little bit on this podcast. And when he mentioned Cheri to me, he was like, look, you've got to meet her. She's got compassion, leadership, and a passion for what she does. And I really think that you two would just totally hit it off. And so we met for coffee and I immediately understood what he was talking about. And I love what Cheri is doing in the healthcare field. And I think with what has been happening in the last few years with the pandemic and how much pressure the healthcare system has been put under, I thought this would be a fabulous interview to have for my audience. So thank you, Cheri, for being willing to come on here.
I'm super excited to be here, Mo, and I'm the Director of Professional Engagement and Nursing Excellence at a large medical center in Seattle, Washington. And I've been doing this gig for, about 29 years in general as a nurse. And so I'm just really honored to be here. I also am a huge super fan of Jered, and Jered said the same thing about you. And so I knew your work was pretty amazing. And so I'm excited to be a part of it.
Yay. Well, thank you so much. I wanted to start off by just, you mentioned, and I have your bio that I'll be sharing with everybody in the notes of the show, but can talk about like the first 20 years of your work where you worked mostly directly with patients. And so I wanted to start off by just asking what started your passion for working directly with patients?
Yeah, that's kind of funny. So I've wanted to be a nurse since I was about 5 years old. I had this book of, like the Golden School Memories book. And when I was in kindergarten, when I was 5, I wrote, I want to be a nurse, N-U-S-E. And part of that, I think, was my mom was a nurse, so I was exposed to her coming home in her uniform and talking about stories of helping people. And that just really landed on me pretty early. And I really never looked back. Like when I think about it, I took some kind of test in high school, like the guidance counselor put out that said, what do you want to do with your life? And it said, hey, you're good in science. You should consider healthcare. And I was like, done. I've already been thinking about that my whole life. So I went straight away to nursing school at Kent State University in Kent, Ohio. In 1990. And yeah, I just don't think I ever looked back.
Was it right off the bat what you expected, or was it in the first couple of years where you just totally surprised?
Yeah, no, I mean, I hated it actually. When I graduated.
Yeah, I love the honesty. Yes.
Yeah, when I graduated, I started on a medical surgical step-down unit in a large teaching hospital in July. And that basically means to anybody who's working in healthcare that that's when all of the new residents start. And so I was working on night shift with really sick patients, and none of us really had any idea what we were doing. And back in those days, we had what we called team nursing. So I was a registered nurse and I would have 5 of my own patients, and then I would resource 5 that an LPN had. And these were really sick, like cardiac step-down patients. So just to give you a frame of reference, that same unit today would have like a 1-to-4 or a 1-to-3 patient nurse ratio.
Oh, wow.
So I had this like giant load and like we had no idea what we were doing. And I remember actually just calling my mom, because I've often described the story of I would be like on my break in the bathroom, like leafing through the yellow pages, because this was like way before phones. And I would be like, I just want to be a travel agent. Like, is there some school for travel agents? Because this gig is awful. And I called my mom and I would say, like, how could you let me do this? People are mean. Like, they're mean to me. I would go in to report in the morning, and I remember the nurses, like I would be giving this load of like all of these patients. And they would say things like, well, why are they on that antibiotic? And I would just be like, I don't know, but they got it on time, because it was going to take me a good 2 or 3 years to be able to like develop the peripheral thinking and really the big picture around what it meant to be a nurse and to care for patients. So I think that my journey is not unique in that reality shock that a lot of nurses feel when they first graduate, but I think I would go on to really find my niche in nursing and really become very passionate about it, which has led to me wanting to really share that passion on a wider level.
Yeah. What do you think were 2 or 3 of your biggest lessons from those first 20 years of
Yeah.
working with direct patient care? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say very early on, learning healthy boundaries around both with you not getting, too close to some of the situations. And that's such a delicate balance because you don't want to lose your empathy, but you also don't. And I've actually described this as vicarious perspective. Like being a nurse is the coolest job ever because you get to be so close to another's human experience that a part of it becomes your own. And you get to see through the lens of that person's experience. And it's just a gift that you don't really have anywhere else in your life, where you just get to be so close to somebody's joy, suffering, pain, perspective that you get to have. So I absolutely have loved that. And I think you want to be close enough to, have that experience, show empathy, connect with your patients, but not also be home in your bed, like crying because you're exposed to so much sadness and grief and loss in the world. So for me, it was really about learning that balance, which I think took me like a good decade or so to learn like how to get close enough, but not so close, and to be able to maintain some empathy and not get jaded, which I've definitely had periods of throughout my career. So I would say that. And then probably the other one is really learning about work-life balance. So there has long been this sort of sense in nursing that, from my opinion, that exhaustion and depletion is something that is like this goal, like I worked 13 hours yesterday, or I was the only one who could do this thing. And when I first started in my nursing career, I felt myself sort of caught up in that like piece of like, oh, how do I keep up, and how do I make my worth shown by how exhausted I am? But what I know is that nurses are also, what the statistics said actually pre-COVID, is that we have 80% higher illness, disability, and absenteeism rates than all other healthcare workers. And for 10 years prior to the pandemic, I was talking to audiences about the level of exhaustion, depletion, and burnout that we were already experiencing. So we sort of went into the pandemic really ill-equipped. And so I think what I had to learn early on was that I wasn't going to adopt that narrative around exhaustion being a status symbol. Like, how do I think I remember having a job probably about 10 years into my career, and I went into a clinic, and I was a research nurse, and they hired me. And on like week 2, my boss called me into her office and she said, everybody else is working until like 6 or 7 p.m. and you're leaving at 4:30 p.m. every day. Like, I can't really justify your role if you are not contributing in the same way. And I said, well, I actually think you're talking about 2 different things. Like, am I contributing enough, or am I just working really long hours and exhausting myself? So I will work from 8 to 4:30 and I will be a really strong contributor and I will do a really good job for you. But if what you're looking for is less about what I produce and more about how long I'm here, I think you probably have hired the wrong person. So I'm not going to do that. And she said, okay, well, let's see what happens then. And it worked. I worked there for 4 years. So I think that was like, but she was kind of taken aback when I first said that, because she was like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Like, I tell you that you work really long hours and you're tired and you say, okay,
Yeah.
But I think early on I learned that like, I didn't want to burn out. I wanted to stay in this profession and I wanted to still care about my patients. So it has taken a lot of intentionality around those boundaries.
I love that. I see that happen too with especially a lot of women across industries. And you and I talked about that a little bit when we met in person. When you were sharing earlier that you speak often about the burnout and what kind of, I'm going to wonder if you do usually share tips and tools. Like, what are a couple things that you've done over the years to create boundaries, create that balance?
Well, I think the biggest thing that I've learned is really so there's a lot of research in trauma theory about like the zone of resilience that we have. Like you have an event happen to you and you sort of go up and down in your autonomic nervous system, which most people, even if you're not in healthcare, know about, like fight or flight, like where you have like your sympathetic nervous system in overdrive, right? So what happens in trauma theory with the zone of resilience is that you can either get stuck on or off out of the normal zone of resilience. So you can get stuck on in what would be like anxiety, panic, hypervigilance, insomnia, like you can't shut off. Or you get stuck off in what looks like lethargy, exhaustion, dissociation, chronic pain, GI issues, depression. And so you can say that like this is nursing, but you could also say this is just society in general, that we have like this kind of pandemic of anxiety and depression. We know that those rates have been increasing pre-pandemic. Certainly they've been increasing throughout the pandemic. And so I think being aware of how we have to sort of widen the up and down, because life is 50% struggle, right? I think we could all agree that life is a series of highs and lows. And it's really about like being able to sort of go along with that and not get trapped in the on or trapped in the off, which is your parasympathetic nervous system. So what I've learned from trauma theory is how you widen that zone of resilience. There are actually two ways. The first is breathing. If you're trapped in the moment where you're out of your autonomic nervous system, breathing, and there's some methods out there like 4-7-8 breathing, where you breathe in for 4, you hold for 7, you purse your lips, you breathe out for 8. 4, hold, 8. And you do that for 4 cycles. It resets your autonomic nervous system so that you can get back in your cognitive domain instead of sort of being trapped in this, on or off state. So that's one tool that I use for like short term, if I'm like really struggling or feeling anxious about something where I just need to reset.
Okay.
As for a long-term tool for tip and trick, it's really what really is evidence-based as far as widening the zone of resilience is something called self-compassion. And the master on that work is Kristen Neff. She's got an amazing website. I think it's self-compassion.org. And she's got like a test you can take to see if you have self-compassion. But what we know is that most of us, particularly women, and I think nurses more than the usual population, often have critics in our voice, on our shoulder, kind of telling us what we aren't enough at, or what we do wrong, or how we need to be better, or how we could have handled that differently. And so what self-compassion work does is kind of slows that process down so that you can talk to yourself like a best friend would, so that you can say to yourself, like, of course you are struggling right now, like anybody would who would be in this situation, and you didn't handle that perfectly, but usually you're a rock star and you can totally do this. And so I think I've done, through a lot of therapy throughout my life, and also just a lot of intentionality around helping other nurses. I've done quite a bit of self-compassion work to try to widen that zone of resilience so that I have a little bit more ability, just to take things as they come, and maybe be less likely. It doesn't always work, I will say, depending on what I'm exposed to. But I think it gives me a little bit more of an edge in that regard.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. I've not heard specifically. I've heard a lot about how you talk to yourself and like talking to your inner child, but I haven't heard it called self-compassion work. So now I'm going to totally go look up that website.
It's amazing. Yeah, she's a master. She's got a lot of videos and things on there, a lot of exercises that you can do in workshops, just some really powerful things that help people recognize the voice of the critic, make it a third party. So it's like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, there you are again. Like, and there's even work around like, you should be self-compassionate towards that voice. Like you should, instead of being like, oh, that critic voice, you should be like, oh, I know you're trying to protect me. I know,
Mm-hmm.
like to your point, it could be some inner child thing. Like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, look where we are. Look how much we've accomplished in our life. We don't necessarily have to have that be automated like that, but anymore, we could be conscious about how we're going to respond here,
Yeah,
you know?
I love that.
Yeah.
One of the things that Jered shared with me when he first told me about you is what you're currently doing now that has to do with the burnout that happened from the pandemic. And so I'm wondering if you can talk and share with us a little bit about what you're doing in your current position.
Yeah. I think my position is a really challenging one right now. To be the director of engagement, it's funny, I've said the director of engagement and nursing excellence, and I've often described it as, actually, I feel like I'm the director of engagement and nursing that's good enough right now, because excellence is a really high bar to reach for in the current
Mm-hmm.
climate. We've had significant staffing issues. I think the average person who doesn't talk to a healthcare worker or provider on a regular basis doesn't really know how much we're still struggling from the impacts of the pandemic. It was at first the fear of, we're going to catch this, we're going to bring it home to our families. We have no idea what this means. We're going to, gown up and go in there and try to figure it out. The changes in PPE that were like the mandates from the CDC were changing as fast as we possibly could keep up, and feeling, there were moments where we were like, wear a mask, don't wear a mask because we have to preserve the masks. I mean, it was literally like we were giving people the opposite information from one day to the next. And I think there was this massive loss of trust. I know there was. The evidence from the American Nurses Foundation, which is the research sector of the American Nurses Association, they've done a lot of well-being surveys throughout the pandemic, and their data is super clear that there's a giant loss of trust nationally by nurses, feeling unsupported. And I think what's really emerging in the literature is this idea of moral injury, moral distress and moral injury, which is you knowing what should happen, but not being able to have that happen. And whether that's knowing what should happen, but we don't have enough staff to make that happen, whether knowing that you should feel protected and feeling like your organization let you down because you didn't have adequate PPE, feeling like you're undervalued. That's another theme that's coming through in healthcare right now, is people just really feeling like they are not seen and heard. Like, in the summer of 2020, we still had survey results from nurses reporting that they felt like they were seen. They felt their organization cared about them. And that's because people were banging pots and pans when they changed shifts. And there was this pride of being a nurse. I remember I was checking out like Whole Foods, and the, bagger brought me a bouquet of roses because I was wearing scrubs, and like you just felt like seen in this really beautiful way. And then cut to a year later, and nurses are not feeling valued. They're feeling like, hey, I showed up, I took this risk, and I don't feel like I'm watching traveler nurses be paid 3 times the amount that I am. And I don't feel like my organization cares about those of us who've been loyal throughout this pandemic. Where's the hazard pay? I think just in general, nurses have felt like they've gotten forgotten along the way in all of this, despite the sacrifices and the effort that they've given and really held this nation up around the pain and suffering. And then you add in the trauma of what people have actually seen on the front line.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
there's a couple different things that can be contributing to this, right? Like there's the volume that people are seeing. So those working with really, high risk areas. There's the risk of contracting, as I said, or bringing it home to your family. And then there's this piece that I've been talking about, which is really demoralization. So feeling like you can't make a difference and you have a lack of power around this.
Yeah.
Right. So I think my job has been, and when I was hired a year ago, I really met with my chief nurse officer and said, I basically just want 2 years to try to make things better in this realm. I just want to bring awareness to the fact that we're suffering in this way. I want to share this idea of moral injury and distress and lack of trust. And where I want my focus to be is kind of twofold. The first is leadership, continued development, because I think a lot of our answers about climbing out on a local hospital level have to do with leadership. Leadership really being authentic, transformational, being able to really see, hear, connect, having, emotional intelligence in our leaders to be able to help grow and develop people, because I think that's really what is needed. People want to feel like, they're seen. And so I think that's one piece. And then the other is this idea of a healthy work environment in healthcare that we've been talking about. Actually, the American Association of Critical Care Nurses launched a healthy work environment initiative like almost maybe 15, 16 years ago, where they were recognizing that there were like 6 tenets, and I'm not sure I'm going to remember them off the top of my head, but they're like skilled communication, true collaboration, authentic leadership, meaningful recognition, appropriate staffing, and then there's one that I'm forgetting, but it's basically like you have these 6 elements in tandem that when you are working together on them, your unit is healthy and nurses can thrive, and all, patient outcomes are completely tied to nurses thriving. So my job has really been about, like, I've been working a lot on healthy work environment. I rolled out a project where we had 32 different units across our 2 campus and ambulatory medical center. I partnered with one of our ambulatory leaders, and we put together a workshop series where we talked to leaders first about what is needed. How do you create psychological safety so people feel safe, they feel like they can question things, speak up. And then we rolled out 4 workshops over this entire year where we grew what we called healthy work environment champions from all these different units to work on projects. And they administered a survey to their team. They found out which of the 6 elements they were most deficient in. And then they worked on a project to try to improve morale, try to improve communication, try to improve recognition on the unit. And that, I think, has been really powerful to see how, like, these small little embers of change, because like everyone's exhausted and could barely like show up sometimes, and you're like, just anything. We have this phrase that comes from the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. It's a model called PDSA, which is Plan, Do, Study, Act in healthcare. And it basically means how you roll out a test of change, how you make a change that's meaningful in healthcare. And during the pandemic, I remembered that one time I had a conversation with somebody from IHI, and they were like, oh yeah, PDSA, please do something, anything. And I think that's really what we've been trying to do, is like all these like, please do something, anything, So I think that's mostly what I've been trying to do, is try to grow our leaders, try to bring awareness to that, and then just try to improve the environment for nurses.
I love that. You've talked about a little bit about this, but one of the questions I had written down was, what motivated you to start speaking and become, I love how you, on your website, it says you're a healthcare storyteller and change agent.
Yeah. I mean, I think this really started maybe 8 years ago or 10 years ago. I attended a presentation that a social worker did, and she was talking about something that's called trauma-informed care. And it's basically like understanding the pathways that people have experienced in their life that lead them to how they behave now, or how they might show up. And she talked about this thing called the ACEs study. Have you ever heard about that?
I don't think so.
The ACEs study is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. It was done in the mid-90s by the CDC and Kaiser, and they looked at 17,500 people, and they looked at their exposure to what they called adverse childhood experiences. So all this like really bad stuff that can happen to you as a kid. And you got a point for each of these things. And if you had like things like you experienced abuse of some kind, you witnessed abuse of some kind, household dysfunction is in that list, neglect, incarceration of a parent. I mean, there's just this whole list of things, and you get a point. And if you have 4 or more ACEs, this amazing study shows like 15 pages of all of the negative health outcomes you are more likely to have. You are more likely to something like 12 times the risk of suicide, 5 times the risk of depression, but then 3 times the risk of heart disease, 5 times the risk of migraines,
Wow.
2.5 times the risk of autoimmune disease. I mean, it was just mind blowing to me. I had been a nurse for 15 years or so, and I had never really understood this link between the emotional experiences that we have and this physical impact on our bodies. And I went up afterwards to the presenter and I was like, I don't think people know this. And she goes, oh, everybody knows this. And I was like, I don't think people know this. Like, this is amazing information, because what it means is that our hospitals are filled with people who have had a history of trauma, right? Because you're more likely to be sick if you have a history of trauma. And so, and it was like this graded thing. Like if you had 4 or more, you were much more likely. But even if you have 1 or 2 ACEs, there's like a dose relationship between these health outcomes. And the Institute for Healthcare Improvement has done a ton of work since then, and they've added things like racism, bullying, like epigenetics, where you have had historical traumas in your life that are sort of passed on to you from the 3 generations before that can show up as trauma. And so I think as this whole body of knowledge expands, it's just been absolutely fascinating for me to learn. And I think what happened when I first heard that, I don't know, 10 or so years ago, I was like, oh, I have to be a part of this movement. Like this has to get out. Every healthcare worker needs to understand this. And then as I started to read more research and find out that healthcare workers are more likely to have higher ACE scores, because we are more likely to have experienced trauma in our lives and want to be drawn to a profession that is converting that trauma to empathy and helping other people not experience pain. So like there's so much to that I just felt like I got to be in there. Like I got to be in there. I got to learn about the stories. I got to tell the stories, and I have to like help with the healing of this profession.
Wow, that's fascinating. And I agree with you. I think most people don't realize that or know that information. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's becoming more mainstream all the time. My daughter goes to college in San Diego, and I was visiting her a couple years ago, and I walked into a coffee shop and there was like this big flyer that said trauma-informed yoga. And I was like, oh, this is amazing. And now, there's this, I probably have this book on my desk here. I talk about this all the time. There's this little book, Trauma-Informed Workplaces. So now I'm doing a lot of work with leaders on like, how are we trauma-informed? And the idea is that you shift the lens from what is wrong with you to what has happened to you. So when you see people show up in a way that's like off-putting, or you're struggling and you're just like, what is wrong with you? It's a switch to like, what has happened in your life that is causing this way of you showing up? And what it does is it taps your empathy. So it's like win-win for everyone, because we are healthier when we are acting out of empathy rather than judgment.
Yeah. So, I love that you said that. That just reminded me, I talk a lot with people about curiosity and why being curious for me has been one of my biggest skill sets that I've harnessed and really used, because curiosity can take me from one place to another. Just like what you just said, from rather than if someone's angry with me or seems to be really frustrated or angry with me, I can say, not so much what did I do or what's wrong with you, but what happened that you're responding this way. Yeah. That's so powerful.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. We talk about that a lot in workshops and such, about like being curious, because we are always so quick to just being reactive and looking through our own lens, and just like that momentary pause, just to like take a breath, and which actually reminds me, there's a tool that I could share with your listeners about that. Okay. Sam Himmelstein is he is an author and a psychologist in Redwood City, California. He's a former incarcerated youth who works with incarcerated youth, and he teaches a lot of like strategies for working with disadvantaged youth. And he teaches this strategy called TAP, which is take a breath, acknowledge how you feel, proceed with a calm tone and a clear intention. And it's basically a moment of mindfulness, and for years when people talked about like meditation or mindfulness, I was super put off by it. I'm just like too high strung. And I was like, oh my God, I can't sit still that long. Like, forget about it. That's not for me. But this I can get behind because it's really just like take a breath, which again widens your zone of resilience, right? Acknowledge how you feel. This is like your feelings are coming for you, whether you like it or not. So you're either going to acknowledge it or it's going to own you, hijack your amygdala and start spinning you in some way that you can't stop. So acknowledge how you feel so you can like move it back into your cognitive domain, and then have a plan. Proceed with like, how do I want to show up right now? How do I want to react right now, rather than just out of sheer reaction? So I feel like that's a tool I use for nurses all the time in like workplace violence prevention, or even in leadership around when you want to be really reactive to a situation that's challenging, like just tap. And I feel like it's been really, life-changing for me to have that tool.
That's fantastic. That would definitely be something I'd love to share with people. Coming from my perspective and everybody who's listening, what is something that we could do to be of support to nurses right now?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Mo. And, I have been long telling healthcare workers, this is going to be a little bit of a lengthy answer as per usual.
Thank you. It's okay.
But I think
all really good information.
I think I've long been telling healthcare workers, like, we look at these trust studies from the American Nurses Foundation, and they're saying like how we've had decreased trust, as I said, over the last 2.5 years. And I say, like, the answers to the questions that are like, does my organization care about my well-being, went from yes to no. Does my organization offer resources that are helpful to me? Yes to no. My organization values my contribution. Again, we see a decrease in these things. And so what I say to people is, do you think that suddenly during like the worst time in modern healthcare that every healthcare organization across the nation was like, you know what? Now's a good time not to care. Like, how about we just stop giving them support? Like, I don't think that happened. I don't think that suddenly every healthcare organization did that. I think we were in a really awful situation to begin with that was not stable enough to handle what came our way. I think it's because we operate on razor thin margins. Most hospitals are not making big bucks. They're barely keeping their doors open. So I think that the biggest solution to what we're faced with right now is actually on a legislative level. I think it's reimbursement for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. I think it's about the payer mix, like all of the things that are contributing to the financial instability of healthcare. That's like for the government to take on. I really believe that. And then I think the second layer is leadership, like I said, and that's why I'm putting a lot of my focus there, because I think it's about this idea that we've sort of had this tough, like, work till you're dead, you're a warrior approach. And I think it's time that we recognize that we're human beings first, and we have to acknowledge, what is needed for us on a balance level in order for us to be able to be successful long term in these careers. And so I think, talking to legislators, like, and making the case for the changes that are needed on a national level, I think that's probably a huge piece. I think people devoting in their organizations efforts to leadership and to the development of emotional intelligence and skills around not just managing people, but actually leading and inspiring them, and seeing them as individuals and trying to grow and develop them as people. I think that's a really powerful thing that we can do. And then we get to the respite part, right? Then we get to the part that's just like, and people need a break, right? First, we need to stop people. Like, if you're thinking about people jumping in the river and drowning, first we need to try to stop people jumping in the river rather than just throwing them life vests. And what we're doing right now is just like throwing our little life preservers out to people. And so I would say that, and I do that with the Healthy Work Environment Project. We're doing a lot of, life preserver throwing. We're redesigning break rooms for nurses. We got a donation. And so our nurses are taking a hand in helping to redesign their break spaces so that they have better respite. So that's kind of like a win-win because it's giving them choice and empowerment, but then also making better spaces so they can take a true break. So I think those things are helpful. I think any ways in which we can help people feel seen and valued right now. During the pandemic, we had all these restaurants that were like providing lunches for nurses, and I think being able to like be seen in that way where people are thanking you for the work you're doing, those small things make a tremendous difference to people. So what's needed is global change across our national healthcare system and the world, pretty much. But what's needed on a like human to human basis is just really people feeling valued again and feeling like their work is really seen and important.
So if somebody was watching today and they wanted to donate, or they could reach out to you and find a way to do that. Okay. I just wanted to make sure to mention that because I think that's always a possibility.
Absolutely. And we definitely use donor funds for doing things to improve the environment and the experiences of our nurses. That's been a really powerful, like pet therapy. Like we've had those. I work with a really wonderful support specialist in our organization who directs our well-being program. And she and I partner in tons of different spaces. And she can funnel a lot of the donation funds into positive things for our team.
Okay. When you, the last question I have for you is, when you speak to different audiences, are you mostly speaking to nurses, or do you speak to the general public about any of the topics that you have? Yeah.
Oh, I just love that question so much because it's kind of funny because I really only like speaking to healthcare workers. Okay. And the reason when I'm not like this, I love sharing these types of messages. But when I'm really talking from like my presentation around like trying to improve healthcare, it just does not land in the same way. My sense of humor is really tailored to nurses and like healthcare workers. I do a lot of like multidisciplinary type conferences. Okay. I've done like pharmacy and physician and social work, respiratory therapy. Largely, I prefer to talk to nursing audiences because I think I just like get it after 20 years of being in the front line, and I think there's a better connection there. But it's really funny because this one time a nurse attended one of my presentations and she's like, "Oh my gosh, this is so amazing. Can you come to my daughter's cheerleading conference?" And I was like, yeah. I mean, I used to be a cheerleader like 25, what am I, 50? Okay, let's say 35 years ago. Yeah, 35 years ago, I was a cheerleader. I talk to cheerleaders. Yeah, sure, I'll come. And so my husband went with me and sat in the audience, and like, they just looked at me like, "What are you talking about?" Like this ridiculous thing. And I left and I was just like tail between my legs, like that was so bad. And my husband was like, "You're amazing." And that was so bad. And I it's like, oh my God, like I will never do that again. And then I got back to my desk, and later that week, the person from the conference sent me an email and she's like, "Oh, that was so great. Could you come back next year?" And I was like, "No, that was not great. And no, I could not come back next year." So that was the end of my career in speaking to non-nursing offices.
Oh my God. You're hilarious because I do see how a lot of your content, just with the little that you've shared with us today, a lot of it could apply to a variety of audiences, and just changing the style of how you talk, though. I understand once you've been in a career like that, the lingo, everything. Yeah. A lot of inside jokes and things.
Yeah. But like I said, I'm always happy to share the struggles and the joys and I talk to a lot of like student nurse audiences, which I just love. And I'm like, okay, like this is the best career ever. Like, and it's so hard, but you get the daily experience of a meaningful life. Like every single day, that you are making a difference in someone's life. And I remember this nurse actually said to me one time, "I think this is the wrong career for me. Like I'm completely exhausted and depleted by it. And I think I should go work in advertising." And I was like, "You know what? my sister works in advertising, and she's like, I feel like I'm just trying to convince people to buy things they don't need. And I feel like I need a meaningful career and I need to go work in healthcare. So I don't know if you can win. You know what I mean? Like, it's always going to look greener on the other side. And I think nursing is a really hard gig right now. I don't want to make light of it. Like, it is a hard gig. It has been, more challenging all the time. And these last 2.5 years, have been incredible, but I think we are ripe for change. I think change is happening really quickly, and I think things are going to shift, and I think we need people to just hold tight and find the joy that they can, and if they're in the wrong job, switch. I have changed jobs in nursing like every 3 to 4 years for 29 years. I just am like, this isn't quite what's right. I need something new. I need to learn something different.
Yeah.
And I think there's something really beautiful about that.
So. Oh, I love that you said that. I think that's fantastic advice. So people don't feel like you're over just stuck in something. You can still do something different within the same field. Yeah.
Yeah. And people will sometimes be like, I don't think I can do that because my resume doesn't like look good when I change jobs. And I have like boldly faced that question in every resume or every interview I've had. They've been like, oh, I see that you tend to move around. I'm like, yes, I have, because I really need to be passionate about my work. And I really need to feel like I'm all in. And if I feel like there's something that I want to learn that's different, or I'm inspired to like take this in a different direction, then I do that. And so I can't promise you that I'm going to be here for 5 years. And my boss actually right now, when she hired me 4 years ago, so I have been here for 4 years, which is like kind of my time limit. And she knows that, but we always joke about it. But, which by the way, I have no intention of leaving because I really love my job right now. But what she said to me is, okay, well, can you like commit to 2 years? Like, could you agree? I was like, yeah, I can commit to 2 years. Like 2 years sounds reasonable.
I love that. Well, I like to end each episode with asking the guest what their current I love it when is for the world. So I'm wondering what your current I love it when is.
Oh, I love it when people help one another grow. I love it when I see like a preceptor on a unit helping a new nurse learn something. I love it when I see, like, my daughter sent me a text today. She's in her last year at the University of San Diego, and she's working as a hostess. And someone took her under her wing and said, I think you should be a cocktail server in addition to being a hostess. So she's going to pick up 1 shift a week doing that. And she sent me this message about how much like this person was able to help her to like learn these skills, and she's really excited about expanding that and trying something different, and she's like stressed about learning the menu, and I gave her the advice that my boss has told me that her mother told her many years ago, which is like, don't be afraid of making a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes. People are watching to see how you handle it. And I just love that. I love it when people help each other grow and they're not afraid to like make a mistake and just help, if you do make a mistake, like use that as an opportunity to keep growing and developing. So I think that's my passion.
I love that. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time and your presence and your energy today, because I know you've been going since very early this morning. So I really appreciate it. And I know I'm excited to get this information out to the listeners. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mo, for collaborating and for the work that you're doing and trying to launch topics that make a difference for people. I think your listeners are really lucky that you care as much as you do. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. And if you guys are listening or watching, please go check out the notes, and you can see information there about how to find more information about how to reach out to Cheri. And if you are interested in having her come and speak, maybe you're a nurse at a local hospital, please do reach out. And thank you so much.
Thanks again.